Welcome back, everyone. We have an exciting panel about advertising, and we're going to get ourselves kicked off with Justin Katz. Justin is a PhD student in business economics at Harvard. His research spans topics in industrial organization, household finance, and spatial economics. So, Justin, please come up.
Thanks. So I'm excited to be on the program and have a chance to discuss my work with Hunt, which is about the potential effects of a Facebook-Instagram separation. So digital platforms sit between two large global markets. On the one hand, 5 billion internet users who spend over 6.5 hours a day online. And on the other hand, digital advertisers who capture about half of the $680 billion spent each year on advertising. Now, because of the importance of these markets, there's significant regulator concern about digital platform market power and questions about what the appropriate regulation responses might be. An important example of this is Meta's joint ownership of Facebook and Instagram. In 2020, the FTC sued Meta for illegally monopolizing the market for personal social networking, where one of the proposed remedies included divestment of Instagram, unwinding the 2012 merger. In this lawsuit, some of the key questions include market scope and market definition, which depends on how substitutable users find the two platforms, as well as more broadly about how a separation might affect both advertisers as well as users. So in this paper, we try to tackle a subset of the questions raised by this type of antitrust enforcement. So first, in theory, how do digital media mergers or separations affect both ad market equilibrium, as well as the distribution of surplus between users and advertisers? And then since we'll find a lot of theoretical ambiguities in that analysis, we'll apply the theory specifically to the case of Facebook and Instagram. I'll first present our theoretical model that features two digital platforms who sell targeted ads to advertisers, and ask in that model, what is the effect of separating ownership of the two platforms? We'll find that separation impacts equilibrium on the user side based on how substitutable users find the two platforms, and on the advertiser side, not just based on how price elastic advertisers are, but also potential scope for a jointly owned set of platforms to be able to coordinate amongst each other to avoid inefficiently targeting the same user with a given set of ads to the extent that users are present on multiple platforms. To speak to the importance of these forces, we're going to present new results on both the user and advertiser side from user and advertiser experiments, which we'll then use to estimate a structural model that we can use for counterfactuals to predict some of the positive and normative effects of separation. So I'm just going to jump right into the model. Our model, I guess, for the academics in the audience is sort of builds on Anderson Cote, which is a model of platform competition between media companies that adds two new features. The first is user-level ad markets due to the fact that digital companies can sell targeted ads. And then the second is user overlap based on the fact that a user might be present on multiple platforms. So we'll have three actors in the model. The first is two platforms, you might call them Facebook and Instagram, who choose ad load to maximize ad revenue. Thanks. They will set ad load based on users' choice of time use across the different platforms. Users will pay no price to use the platform service, but they will dislike ads. So that sort of functions as the implicit price for users. Based on ad load and preferences over the different platforms, users will choose time use to maximize their utility. Finally, advertisers will purchase ads that they sell to users to try to get clicks. They'll have some fixed profit that they get per click, and they'll pick a certain quantity of clicks to get an expectation to maximize their profits. The targeted advertising technology will be basically platforms selling an individual campaign to advertisers, where the platforms will have a very precise signal of individual users' click-through rates for a given impression for a particular advertisement. Our model features kind of diminishing returns to additional impressions, something that we'll estimate. We'll make an assumption that on separation, both platforms basically have the same predictions about click-through rates for individual users. We're going to make two assumptions that are going to simplify the analysis. I'll talk through them as opposed to showing them formally, but The first assumption is basically that click-through rates are independent across users and don't depend on things like user time use or loss from duplication. Let me make sure I'm in the right place here. Yeah, and then the second is that we'll assume the distribution of platforms' predicted profit per impression across advertisers is basically the same for each individual user. And then the contract that platforms will offer to advertisers is as follows. So an advertiser is going to tell the platform how many ads or how many clicks they want to get. And then the platform will serve the set of users for whom they predict the price per click will be the lowest. So that roughly approximates what platforms like Meta do in practice. So in this model, we're going to consider two equilibria. The first is a merged equilibrium, where the two platforms are owned by a single entity that both sets ad load jointly and also coordinates where they serve ads to avoid inefficient duplication, and also a separated equilibrium where neither of those things are true. You have two competing platforms. So in the merged equilibrium, we'll have an individual ad market for each user on the platform that'll give rise to user-specific ad prices. And that price is just going to clear individual specific markets for advertising. So it'll equate the supply of ads, which depends on platform ad load and user time on platform, with demand for ads. That's basically just the fraction of advertisers who, based on equilibrium prices, find it profitable to try to impress a given user. Now, with our assumptions, we get a very simple expression for prices. That's just a decreasing function of the amount of ads on the platform. In the separated equilibrium, platforms compete and set ad load individually and also are unable to coordinate to avoid inefficient duplication. There's still individual level platform specific market clearing, which means that there's going to be a person by platform specific price for each individual user. Now, since platforms can't coordinate to avoid duplication, advertisers recognize that when they buy an ad on a given platform, it might be duplicating an ad that's running on the other platform. The strength of that effect is going to depend on both the loss from duplication, that zeta parameter, as well as this O prime term, which is basically the probability that a marginal impression on a given platform is duplicated. And that'll be an endogenous function of basically both platform time use and user time on each platform. Now, kind of working through the same algebra, you get another simple expression for user by platform specific prices, where the key thing to note is that the presence of overlap essentially shades down advertiser demand. And so this is something that both matters for welfare and a strategic thing that platforms might consider. Now, given user specific prices, platform revenue just adds up the quantity of ads times the price for each ad. So when ownership is separated, there are a number of different forces that point in multiple different directions, but I'm going to talk through three for how ad load might change. The first is a user side force based on the fact that once platforms are separated, they have to compete more aggressively for users. Since users dislike ads, this is a force towards improving platform quality for users as platforms try to attract their time. Pointing in the other direction, though, is competition on the advertiser side. And while there's kind of the typical result in this market that more competition will lead to more ad load, there are also two specific forces based on the fact that there are potentially overlapping impressions in these digital markets. So the first force is what you might call like a mechanical or inframarginal effect, which basically overlap reduces ad quality, which reduces the disincentive for platforms to increase ad load, which would kind of reduce the price of each ad and reduce their inframarginal revenue. And the second is a strategic effect, which is based on the fact that in our model, platforms serve advertisements to the people with the highest predicted click-through rate first. And so basically what this means is that a platform with more ad load on the margin is serving a different set of people than a platform with less ad load, which means that advertisers are less aversive or view the quality decrease as a result of overlap to be lower on the platform with higher ad load. And so this creates an incentive to increase ad load to try to increase ad quality, avoiding overlap. So for the user side effect, this quality incentive effect, the important parameters are how much users dislike ads and also diversion across the two platforms. On the advertiser side, what matters is both user overlap across the two platforms and the diminishing returns to additional impressions. So now we'll try to provide some evidence on the strength of these forces by looking at 3 different experiments, reanalyzing 2 existing experiments on the user side and designing a new experiment on the advertiser side. So the user side experiments will be informative about both just measuring user overlap across these 2 platforms, as well as estimating how much users value time spent on each platform and user diversion. The advertiser side experiment will be geared towards estimating the loss from a duplicated campaign. So to understand user overlap and the value of time use, we're going to reanalyze the Alcott-Jenskow Song digital addiction experiment. This was a sample of about 2,000 Facebook and Instagram users who were voluntarily recruited for Meta ads. The experimental intervention was a bonus payment to reduce social media use in a series of different product categories, including Facebook and Instagram. And the main outcome we observe is how much time users spend on each of these platforms. So the first thing to look at is just how much time is spent on each platform. So what I'm showing here is just the joint distribution of time use on Facebook and Instagram, where the offset bars to the left and the bottom give information about user overlap between these 2 platforms. So the bar on the top left shows that essentially 10% of Instagram users spend no time on Facebook, and the bar on the bottom right shows that about 30% of Facebook users spend no time on Instagram. So from that, you can immediately see that a larger fraction of Instagram users are multi-homers relative to Facebook users, which means Instagram will be more subject to both the kind of mechanical as well as strategic effects of overlap when we estimate our model. Second, we can analyze the effect of the bonus payment on time use, which is informative about how much users value time spent on the platform. On the horizontal axis here, I'm showing just the experimental week where the treatment period is highlighted in gray. And on the vertical axis, I'm showing the treatment effect of being in the bonus payment group relative to the control group. Now you can see that the bonus payment reduces time on platform for both Facebook and Instagram users, but does so less for Instagram relative to Facebook. And that immediately tells you that the value of time use diminishes more rapidly for Instagram users relative to Facebook users, which affects how intensively each platform will compete on the user side in a potential counterfactual separated equilibrium. To estimate diversion, we're going to use results from a different experiment, the 2020 Facebook Instagram election study. This was a random sample of about 20,000 Facebook and 20,000 Instagram users. The treatment in this case was a large versus a relatively smaller bonus payment to deactivate a particular account completely in the 6 weeks in the run-up to the 2020 election. And again, we observed mobile screen time as our main outcome. So the first thing we can look at is how shutting down Facebook use affects time spent on Instagram. So basically how substitutable the 2 platforms are for Facebook users. Facebook use goes down significantly by about 35 minutes a day, and Instagram use increases a little bit by about 2 minutes. We can do the same thing for the effects of an Instagram deactivation on Facebook use. Here, it seems like there's relatively less diversion. So I think overall, it seems like there's some substitutability, at least in the short term, between these platforms, but it might be relatively limited, with the caveat that these are short-run diversion ratios that might increase if the shutdown occurred for a longer period besides 6 weeks. Now, finally, we can turn to the advertiser side. So this is the new experiment where we ask how much lower click-through rates are when a campaign is duplicated versus when it's only seen once. And so to estimate this, we're going to run experiments as meta advertisers. So conceptually, what we're going to do is recruit 2 different audiences that we want to retarget using Meta's retargeting tools. For one of those audiences, we're just going to show a simple kind of generic ad creative like you see on the right. And to another audience, we're going to basically serve the same campaign twice to the exact same audience, where we can estimate using Meta's internal tools the probability that a given impression in the duplicated audience is in fact seen twice by the same person. Then we'll compare click-through rates in the non-duplicated versus duplicated treatment to estimate the loss from duplication. Now that's kind of conceptually what we're doing, but we're actually going to run that kind of paired design in a bunch of different times to account for a couple of different design considerations. The first is making sure that our advertisements are broadly representative of what an advertiser might run on Meta. So we're going to do this for 15 different creatives that span common product categories. We also have to recognize that we can't control all the parameters that govern how Meta runs the ads. So things like ad frequency or the fraction of our target audience that actually ends up being impressed. And so to understand how that might affect results, we're going to vary the parameters of the ads to vary frequency and ad intensity. On this slide, I'm just showing kind of very, very preliminary results from one pilot where we basically ran this for just that Tide ad on the previous slide. So, take these results with a grain of salt because they're only five dots. But here on the horizontal axis, I'm showing the probability that a given impression in the duplication treatment was seen twice by the same person. And on the vertical axis, I'm showing the ratio between the click-through rate in the duplicated audience versus the non-duplicated audience, where the numbers look a little bit funky because I'm regression adjusting for frequency and intensity differences across these treatments. The thing to note, though, is that as the overlap fraction increases and in the extreme extends out to 1, the relative click-through rate in the duplicated condition drops. And again, these are preliminary results, but these estimates imply that a duplicated campaign is about 30% as effective as an initial campaign. So it seems like there are substantial losses from duplication. So that's all to say on our empirical evidence. We're going to use those estimates to estimate a structural model, which is just a quantitative version of the model I showed at the beginning. We're going to estimate parameters using minimum distance, just minimizing differences between model predictions and what we see in the data. We're going to use the user-side experiments to get most of the user-side parameters, with the exception of how much users dislike ad load. We're going to get that based on a Facebook internal experiment, which is based on the difference in time use between most users and a long-term holdout group who has never shown ads for a period of about 9 years. When we analyze the results of that experiment, we find that a 10% increase in ad load reduces time spent on the platform by about 1%. So there's some aversion to ads, but it's not huge. Then just kind of to close the loop, we get advertiser price elasticities by observing current ad load and assuming that that ad load is chosen to maximize profits within our model. Okay, so with the estimated model, we can understand the counterfactual effects of Facebook Instagram separation. So in the first column here, I'm just showing baseline values. The second column shows level differences from that baseline as a result of a separation. And the third column just puts that in percent terms. The first thing to note is that separation increases ad load. So this tells us that since users are relatively inelastic to ad load, and our model says advertisers are fairly price elastic, in separated equilibrium, the two platforms compete more on the ad side than on the user side. This means that users spend less time on the platform, but the main effect is to significantly reduce ad prices. This is for two reasons. One, because ad load increases, and so market prices have to drop to clear markets. The second is because ad quality goes down, because in the separated equilibrium, the platforms can't coordinate to avoid inefficient duplication, something that advertisers take into account. The hit is especially large on Instagram because it has more overlap. So more Instagram users are multi-homers, and so overlap is more severe on that platform. These changes turn to consumer surplus, reduce consumer surplus to surplus effects. These reduce consumer surplus by about 1%. But the main effect is a big transfer from platforms to advertisers. One thing to note is that the benefit to advertisers would be about twice as large without this duplication effect. So if it were possible to separate platforms while still allowing some coordination to avoid duplication, then the advertiser surplus effects would be about twice as large. Overall, we find that together advertisers and consumers win, platforms lose, and there's a roughly neutral total surplus effect. Now, finally, we can ask how our results might have been different if we had estimated different parameters. So to understand that, we're going to change parameters one at a time, leaving all others at their estimated value, recompute both emerged and separated equilibrium, and then plot the total surplus effects of separation as a fraction of baseline surplus. If we had estimated that user diversion were larger, so consumers substituted more aggressively between the platforms, then we would have had less of a total surplus loss. The reason is because consumers are a large fraction of total surplus, and so if platforms are competing more on the user side, that's generally better for welfare. If consumers cared more or less about ad load and equilibrium, then the total surplus effects of the merger would be more positive. The reason for this non-monotonic relationship is sort of two extremes. So one, in the extreme where users don't care about ad load at all, then this is sort of a regular one-sided separation, which is going to unambiguously improve welfare by increasing competition. If consumers cared a ton about ad load, then platforms would compete on the user side, which, as I previously discussed, would be better for welfare. So we're sort of at a nadir where consumers care enough about ad load to be harmed by separation, but not so much that they're prioritized in the separated equilibrium. Finally, if there were either less overlap across users or the loss from duplication were lower, then the effects of a separation would be larger. And this sort of tells you that, both in markets with less overlap or in contexts where it's possible to allow for coordination on the advertiser side without joint ownership, you might be able to achieve better welfare results. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. So we provide what we think is a relatively tractable equilibrium model to characterize the effects of digital media mergers and how that might affect equilibrium ad load. I think our main findings show that the user side of a separation is potentially less relevant than the advertiser side because, at least in the short run, diversion appears to be low, and in the long run, users are pretty inelastic to ads. Our results also highlight that the feature of wasteful duplication means that both separation is less good than it possibly could be, and also implies a large potential gain from coordinating in a separated equilibrium. And the final thing is that the total surplus effects are relatively small of this kind of separation, and we saw sign flips based on plausible alternative parameterizations. And there's some limitations of our analysis, which we can discuss. I think the main one to flag is that we're only considering the static effects of a separation based on changes in ad load. There might be other things that antitrust authorities care a lot about, which are quite important, things like the quality of the user experience or privacy considerations, dynamic concerns, for example, regarding advertiser or platform entry, as well as more technological things such as joint ownership, allowing for more investment to improve the quality of ad targeting or attribution systems. But I'm eager to hear the discussion to touch on some of these points. Thanks.
Thank you. And next, we're going to hear from Cristobal Cherry. He's from Cornell University and is an assistant professor in the Department of Information Sciences.
Okay, so first of all, thank you to the organizers for putting together this great conference and inviting me. I'm going to show this paper where we studied whether the Apple tracking transparency framework that was introduced in 2021 harmed the app ecosystem in some way. This is okay. So if you remember back in 2021, Apple introduced a change in the operating system that modified the way in which apps request for permission to track users. The change effectively changed behavioral tracking that is used for targeted advertising from an opt-out model to an opt-in model. So before being able to track users, the app has to ask. And not only that, the user can only now set up a setting in which system-wide they can tell the operating system not to allow apps to track them. So anecdotal evidence suggests that this greatly reduced the fraction of users that were consenting to tracking. So this gives us a great opportunity to study what is the relationship between tracking, the use of data, and the provision of ad-supported goods. To explain this, nobody does this better than Facebook. Facebook at the time mounted a national campaign. They bought full-page advertising on newspapers, setting this up as Apple versus the free internet. The argument says that Apple was trying to roll this forced software update that will change the internet as we know it for the worse, like thinking your favorite cooking sites, sports blog. This all worked because of advertising, and with this change that Apple is introducing, they may have to start charging you subscription fees, adding in-app purchases, and this is going to make the internet expensive. It's going to reduce high-quality free content. So what we wanted to do in this paper was to test this and see whether this change that Apple introduced changed the provision of free goods. Is there going to be an increase in exit? Will people leave the market? Will they abandon their apps, stop updating them? Are they going to change the business model Are they going to, I don't know, move away from an ad-supported model to adding in-app purchases? The apps that remain, like, will they be different? Will users value them in different ways? What's going to happen when we compare new apps that were introduced before this change and after this change? And what's going to happen with the demand of apps? So ultimately, we want to look at this broad set of attributes of apps to determine what are the costs of this policy that was introduced by Apple in the availability and the quality of the apps available in the app ecosystem. So we were not the first, and this is not the first shock to affect the availability of tracking in online systems. When GDPR came around, there were several studies that looked into this. Some of them found strong effects. We know that after GDPR, there was a lot of exit of apps and a reduction in entry of apps. In other settings, there wasn't so much an effect. In one of my papers with co-authors, we studied news websites, media websites that are supported by advertising, and we don't find much of an effect. We see how they reply. We see the response changing over time. What we don't observe is them going out of business. We don't see them posting fewer content. We don't see them receiving fewer visitors. Essentially, we don't see that change affecting the provision of the news and media websites. People have also started looking into what is the effect of this Apple's tracking transparency. And there has been some effect on the change, making it more difficult for apps to acquire users, like apps advertise to get users, and that became more difficult. So the acquisition of users has been affected, and there is a small effect on apps moving from ad-supported to paid. Okay, so what we're going to do is that we're going to track all the apps that exist in both the Google ecosystem and the Apple ecosystem. We're going to look at a window of 18 months around April 2021. That is when the policy was introduced. We don't want to do longer than that because these ecosystems are very dynamic, and if we start stretching, we may catch additional changes like operating system updates, etc. But we need at least 9 months to see if there are like some anticipation effect and what's going to be the short and long-term differences. And we're going to look at the universe of apps. So instead of focusing on like the top apps, we want to look at like every possible app and see if there are differences there. Okay, so just to give a preview of how the number of apps look in both ecosystems, this is how many apps were available on Apple, that is the blue line, and Android, that is the red line, from 2015 to 2023. Apps were increasing in number until around GDPR came around. Then there is that sharp drop in availability of apps that seems to affect Android a lot more than Apple. Then things kind of stabilize. When ATT comes, like we see a drop in the Apple ecosystem, but then it seems to recover. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a moment. So we're going to assume that this ATT shock was exogenous and that it's only affecting the Apple ecosystem. That is not entirely correct because the change was announced. So Apple told developers like 9 months, a year in advance that they were going to do this. So they told them like in a future operating system update, we're going to make this change. Why we're still saying this is exogenous is because they didn't tell them when. So they said, we're thinking about this. They didn't say, we're going to do this in a given day. And effectively, they only gave people 1 week notice of this change being rolled out. So they knew it was coming. And then they got a notice like, oh, it's coming next week, by the way. We're going to do a difference in difference analysis and compare the evolution of Google versus Android. And we're going to also do some event studies to check parallel trends, short-term effects, delay effects, etc. Okay, so we're going to look at several variables. First, we look at entry, exit, and updates, and these are related to the incentives to innovate in the ecosystem, maintain products in the market, keeping your product, creating new products. Then we want to analyze too how the makeup of these apps change with the policy. So when developers create these apps, they don't create all the code from scratch. They use these software developer kits that are like prepackaged functionalities that they can just add to their apps. So looking at which of these are being used by the apps allow us to understand how the developers are adjusting the functionalities in response to the policy. And then we're going to look at the number of ratings and the average rating that apps receive, and we're trying to use this as a proxy for DMA and side effects of the policy. Okay, so in terms of exit, entry, and updates, the idea here is that if the ability to monetize investments in app development is affected negatively by the introduction of ATT, we should see less entry. If keeping apps in the market is costly, we also should increase exit. The effect of exit is tricky because while launching an app requires like developing and putting it in the market, once the app is in the market, the cost of keeping it there is very low. So developers pay, I think, about $100 to have an active account on the Apple App Store. And if they have that active account, they can keep their app in the store. Also, the change that was introduced didn't really make any, it didn't disable any app. So if you didn't adapt your app, the only thing that changed is that you wouldn't get this advertising identifier, but the app would continue to work. So it's unclear if it's going to affect exit in any way. What's more interesting is looking at updates. Past research in apps have looked in updates as a measure of continued commitment to the app. Maybe with the change, you don't exit. I mean, it's already there. It costs very little money to keep it, but you may stop like releasing new apps and updating the apps that you already have. However, I mean, looking at updates is also very tricky because if the app is stable, it is well liked, there is no problems with it, you don't have a good reason to update it. Whereas if the app is not great, receiving poor ratings, then you have more incentives to update the app and try to fix those problems. So with those caveats in mind, we look at these variables when we're looking at entry and exit. What we're doing is counting the number of apps that enter and exit per genre and per platform in a given month. And we use a traditional diff-in-diff setup. We're interested in the post-ATT Apple dummy, and we're using genre fixed effects, time fixed effects. When we're looking at updates, we're using app level data. We have our dependent variable is going to be a dummy equal to 1 if the app was updated during time t or not. Okay, so what we find when we look at the universe of apps is that there is a decrease in entry, and this decrease seems significant statistically and in terms of magnitude. When we look at exit, there isn't like much of a difference. It's only marginally significant. And in terms of update, there is a decrease, but the magnitude of this coefficient is very, very low. I mean, it's in the order of 0.5, 1%. It's not a huge effect. What is worth considering is where this decrease in entry comes from. And if we look at the event study, what happens over time, what we see is that there is a huge sharp decrease in entry like the month after, 2 months after the change is implemented, and then things go back to normal. I mean, this makes intuitive sense, especially if developers were getting 1 week notice of this change. I mean, think if you're going to release a new app in the market, then the Apple tells you that there is this new requirement that you have to change something in your code. You don't release it. You have to figure out what is it that you have to change it, and then release it. So yeah, the way we're interpreting this is that, yeah, I mean, this is announced, entry practically stops for a couple of weeks until developers figure out how to do this new thing, how they're going to adapt their app, and then it resumes pretty much to the level it was before. Okay, so we next look at the use of these software development kits. So as I was explaining before, these are third-party tools that developers can use to incorporate functionalities in their apps. We're going to focus on, there are many of them, and they work for different things. We're interested in 4 that we think are related to this policy change. We're going to look at monetization SDKs. These are used to monetize apps through advertising. The most popular examples are the Facebook Audience Network or Google AdMob or IronSource. The developers put these SDKs and then the app shows ads to users and developers get paid for that. Then there is another related set of SDKs that are called ad mediation. These are very similar to monetization SDKs. The only difference is that instead of connecting to a specific vendor like Facebook, they're trying to collect to multiple platforms, trying to allocate the impression to the platform that's going to pay them the most. So these are essentially aggregators of different advertising networks to try to get better prices. So example of this is like the AdMob mediation adapter, IronSource mediation adapter, etc. Then there is payment SDKs that are used for processing credit card transactions like MasterCard and Stripe and Square, Venmo. They all have their SDKs that people can use to incorporate payments through those networks in the app. And the last category we're looking at are authentication SDKs. And this allows apps to let users log in using credentials from different platforms. So this is like the single sign-on that you commonly see in websites and in apps. Rather than running their own authentication systems, platforms can use something to authenticate users through their Facebook accounts, through their Google accounts, etc. So this saves the platform the effort to developing their own sign-in system. And it can also be used to track users on a first-party basis, because once the user logs into your platform, you know who they are, and then you can collect information on them, not on a third-party basis, but on a first-party basis. Okay, so when looking at all the apps, we see a decrease in monetization and ad mediation. So these are removed to some extent. And then we see an increase in authentication and payment SDKs. Like all these things are statistically significant, but if you look at the size of the coefficients and then the mean of the dependent variable, again, the practical effect sizes of these are not huge. Again, it's changes in the order of 1%, 0.5%. So this pattern in which we see less ad mediation, less monetization, and more payments and more authentication, it suggests that there is a shift in revenue models towards something less centered on advertising, less centered on third-party tracking. But as I said before, like these effects are statistically significant, but the economic significance of this is mostly trivial. Having said that, not all apps are the same. Some apps rely more on advertising than others. For example, gaming apps are essentially almost always monetized through advertising. If you look at the use of SDKs, game apps are by a large margin the most likely to have monetization and ad mediation SDKs by a margin of 2/2. And these are the ones that are showing the biggest decline in the use of this monetization and ad mediation, and the largest increase in the use of these payment SDKs. Okay, so next we move into studying changes on how users value apps. Why we should expect that there may be an effect comes from different ways. So from one side, it may be the case that ATT leads to users decreasing their valuation of apps. Maybe these less frequent updates are going to lead to unresolved bugs, going unresolved for a very long time. Feature requests are not going to be addressed. The apps themselves are going to get outdated, and all those things should lead to negative effects on valuations, on reviews, on ratings. It could also be the case that apps are adjusting their business models, adding more in-app payments. Maybe they're getting less revenue from advertising because it's less targeted, and they increase the number of ads that are showing users. Users may dislike these changes on how apps are making money. The apps themselves can become less functional. This tracking is used for things like recommendations, like functionalities tell you what is the nearest, I don't know, restaurant to where you're located. And the targeting of advertising If all those things become less relevant again, maybe the ratings of apps are going to go down. You can also think some reasons why the ratings could go up because of ATT. For example, there's several apps that exist with the sole purpose of mining data and then selling it to third parties. There are apps that have maybe too much advertising. If ATT leads to the exit of those apps because those business models don't seem attractive when people can block you from tracking them, then the average rating of apps that remain in the market may go up. So maybe that exit is not necessarily a welfare loss, maybe it's a welfare gain if the people that is going out of the markets are the ones that have predatory privacy practices. Okay, so what we do is that we're going to look at the number of new ratings received by apps, so how many ratings an app gets in a given month. And we're going to think this is a proxy for downloads. And then we're going to look at the average rating of those ratings that were received in a given month. And we're going to think of this as a proxy for quality of the apps. So looking at the universe of apps, there is a reduction in the number of new ratings. There is an increase in the number of apps that receive no ratings in a given month. And the average rating goes down by a little bit. Now, it's also important to uncover this. So here I'm looking at the universe of like 1.8 million of apps. There is new apps, existing apps. So we try to untangle a little bit where this could be coming from. Okay, so when I was explaining why we should expect ratings to change, one of the things I said is that if there is a change in the update frequency, that we do observe that apps get updated less frequently after ATT, this could lead to lower ratings. So what we're going to do next is analyze two different things, like compare apps that were pre-existing in the market and versus apps that were introduced after ATT. Maybe the apps that existed before the markets, before the intervention, are the ones that are getting abandoned. Maybe the apps that were introduced after ATT were introduced already thinking with the framework in mind, and they may have different characteristics. For those, as we cannot really do a diff in diff of something that didn't exist before ATT, what we do is that we look at the ratings that apps that are introduced to the market get during the first month that they are listed. So we look apps that were introduced before, how did they do in the first month? Apps that are introduced after, how did they do on the first month? Then for the existing apps, we're going to do kind of an heterogeneous treatment effects in which we look at the apps that get no updates after ATT, the apps that are updated more frequently after ATT than they were updated before, and the apps that are updated less frequently than they were updated before. Okay, so looking at the first month of sale, the results are shifted from what I showed you before. So now apps that are introduced after ATT, they do better in the first month they're in the market than apps that they were introduced before. So the likelihood that they receive no ratings is smaller, and they get more ratings on average during the first month. And we don't observe any statistical significant change in terms of average rating. This one is wrong. Okay, so in looking at how the results change by the update frequency, if we look at the apps that are not updated, like the apps that are abandoned after ATT, those are the ones that are affected the most. So there's where we see the largest coefficients. They get fewer ratings, they get worse ratings on average. The apps that are updated more frequently, we see more reviews and we see better ratings. And the apps that are updated, still updated, but less frequently than they were before, they get fewer ratings, worse ratings, but the effect is much smaller than on the apps that were abandoned. Okay, so just to summarize, what we found was that right after ATT, there is a noticeable reduction in the number of available apps in the iTunes ecosystem, but this change is temporary. Like 3-4 months after ATT, the overall number of apps had recovered and even increased in comparison to the Android ecosystem. And we find no evidence of increased exit or reduced entry in the long term. We do find that update frequency slightly decreases. Now, looking at the use of SDKs suggests that apps are adjusting the revenue model. They are changing what they do. We see a very small decrease in the use of monetization, not mediation SDKs. We see an increase in authentication and payment SDKs. Having said that, it's very important to have in mind the magnitude of these effects because it's not huge. These are changes of maybe 1% of the apps reduce the number of monetization and mediation SDKs. That is probably not going to change the market that significantly. And then looking at the ratings, the number of new ratings and average rating is lower after ATT, but only for existing apps. Not every app is affected in the same way. New apps introduced after ATT are more likely to get at least one review during the first month of sale and get more ratings on average. And then for the existing apps, if we look at separate between those that reduce the update frequency and increase the update frequency, we find like opposing effects. The apps that were abandoned, that were updated less frequency, are the ones where the number of ratings, the average rating is going down. In comparison, those that are updated more frequency are getting better ratings and more ratings per period. Okay, so thank you.
Great, thank you. You've both given us a lot to think about. So I'm going to ask some questions and then open it up for everyone to ask questions as well. Justin, I'll start with you. What I found fascinating about your study was it seemed to show that one of the things it affects is that the duplication of users between the two platforms is not as high as we might think, right? The overlap is not as high as we might think between Instagram and Facebook. And at the same time, it seems like the consumer benefit that we're talking about is the reduction in duplication of ads that you might see. But if there isn't as much of an overlap between the audiences, is duplication as much of a concern?
Yeah, so I think the main takeaway is that for Instagram, it's a big concern because about 90% of Instagram users are also on Facebook. For Facebook, it's a little bit less of a concern because about 70%, only about 70% of Facebook users are also on Instagram. So I think overall duplication is a big issue. Like advertisers think about this based on conversations that I've had. I think the relative amount of duplication, like in the model, appears to be important, but I think it's not a trivial issue.
Yeah, and you know, there are two kinds of ads, right? There's the direct response ads, and then there's the brand awareness ads. Would duplication matter more for one kind or the other?
That's a good question. I think based on my conversations, it's a bigger issue for kind of less top of funnel stuff, more direct targeting. And so, you know, to the extent that those are the ads that probably have the most direct mapping between impressions and revenue, I think it's still sort of first order.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is, right, you're seeing a shift. We thought that we'd move to a world where most of ads would be direct response ads. Mm-hmm. We're actually seeing the opposite shift, where more and more advertising over time is brand response. And do you have sort of looking at this data and, you know, can you speculate as to why that's happening and how should regulators be thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one possibility is concerns over quality of tracking technology diminishing. So if you think that in a long run, your ability to really directly target ads is gonna decline, then you might want to focus more on top of funnel where direct attribution is less of an issue. But besides that, I don't have any.
Yeah. No, and Cristobal, I mean, it's a fascinating study of what I would view as almost a null result, right? That the chicken, you know, everyone was saying before that the sky was going to fall once AT&T was introduced, you're going to see massive changes. And obviously your study shows that they're very modest, if not trivial. What is that? What is the sort of policy implication of that would you draw for somebody who wants to push a more aggressive privacy law? Would this suggest to me as a privacy, say, regulator would be, yeah, it doesn't actually change the ecosystem that much for the economy, and I get more privacy for my constituents. Is that kind of the takeaway that I should take from reading this paper?
I would say probably not.
Okay.
So, I mean, if we look, okay, so I have two opposing thoughts on the matter. From one side, when GDPR came around, like the sky was going to fall. I mean, it's been 5-6 years now. It did. ATT, the same thing. I mean, if you look like this ad by Facebook, yeah, I mean, we're not seeing those things happen. From the other side, I would be careful of bringing too much out from what we did, because if you think the change was introduced by Apple, the availability of apps, the quality of the apps is a very important complement for the iPhone ecosystem. So probably Apple, when they designed this, they were careful on not rolling out something that was going to affect the ecosystem. And the second consideration is that something that we couldn't do is to see what were the substitution between the use of third-party technologies with first-party technology. So ATT has been criticized a lot as pushed by Apple to capture more of the tracking and advertising ecosystem. So yeah, I mean, I would say it depends. And those are the kind of factors that go into play.
Okay, great. Questions? Yeah.
Two really interesting papers. Oh, that's two really. I'll just talk about
No, we've got a live stream. So.
it.
Nope. There it goes. Okay. Sorry about that. Two very interesting papers. I have a question for Cristobal and then an inside baseball question for Justin. So, and this sort of picks up what you're just talking about. So this is a privacy policy being instituted by a walled garden provider 2 years after GDPR. And so the question is, are we really learning? What are we learning about in some sense? I mean, it's a very interesting paper, but it seems as though you wouldn't expect to find much after we've already had a sort of an arguably draconian policy. Plus, Apple is really kind of different. They're not the Wild West in the way that the Android environment was. And then just a quick inside baseball one for Justin. You mentioned changing one parameter at a time, holding all others constant. But does that deliver the data back, or do you have to change, hold one constant, re-estimate all the other parameters? So inside baseball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's a fair question. How different can this be from GDPR after there was so many people writing about GDPR? There is a few things. One is that yeah, I mean the fact that it's a walled garden, I think, is actually good, because GDPR, like one of the problems we're doing GDPR study is like you didn't even know what to compare against. Like everyone was affected. In theory, like. Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that to be true. I think not everyone was affected in the same way. The EU was affected a lot more, like at least in the studies that I did. I saw very different responses by people in the EU, by people everywhere else. But yeah, I mean, it was less clean, like who was affected and who was not. I mean, the case of this Apple change, it's very clear who is affected. I mean, there is no reason to expect there is going to be much spillovers between Apple and Google.
I can give a short response. I think that would be targeting something a little bit different conceptually. It would be more like robustness to our results if we had measured something else in the data relative to what I think we're trying to do, which is, if the structure of people's preferences were different, how would that impact our results? So I think the exercise you said is legitimate, but it would be a little bit more about like how robust our findings are, as opposed to, how do different behaviors observed in the world actually impact our normative conclusions.
Super interesting session. Question for Cristobal, just based on this slide
I was just thinking about consumer valuations of privacy. And do you have the text of the reviews to understand, like,
Yeah,
what they're mentioning? But like, I have a sort of bigger point, which is that in a lot of these studies, like, you know, these policies are motivated by protecting consumer privacy. We don't have, at least my view is that we don't have good measures. And maybe as people who study the econ of tech, is like we say that, well, privacy is a right, we don't know how to value it. But then in the cost and benefit, we just leave it out, right? So in a narrow sense, do you have a sense of what these people are saying? But in a broader sense, do you have a take? Just want
Right.
your take.
Okay, so in the narrow sense, yeah, I mean, we do have the text and we do look into it. People don't mention privacy all that much. So we did NLP, look for keywords, and it's not an issue that comes out in the reviews all that frequently. The second question on, like, yeah, I mean, privacy, how do we value it? Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's a more complicated question is, or a more complicated take is like, what is the inherent value? Like, what is my consumer surplus from having more privacy? I think that is going to be very, very difficult to measure. There are other ways, though, in which we can measure privacy, or what is the impact of privacy. For example, there is a study, I don't remember the authors now, that look at what was the impact of ATT on fraud. And they did find that after ATT was released, there was a decrease in fraud because, yeah, I mean, advertising can be fraudulent. Third-party tracks collect data that then is used by people that run scams, do identity theft, etc. So yeah, I mean, there is measurable gains from increasing privacy that are easier to grasp than this, like, oh, what is my inherent value from this human right that some people may have, some people may not.
I appreciate both excellent papers. Yeah, two questions. One, just building on that and actually going back to Mihir's question. I don't understand, Cristobal, how you can say that your paper hasn't proved that when you give people a really transparent choice architecture and they decide, I don't want to be tracked, and nothing bad happens to the app environment, that things haven't gotten better. I mean, those users are choosing something that they evidently like, and the app environment hasn't moved. It sounded to me like your answer was Apple has done sneakier things to track them and their privacy is still being invaded. That's fine, but that's not in the paper. So I feel like if that's where you are, I'd like to have a strong statement on that topic. And then I have a question for Justin, which is, it feels, so this is a fine answer, but it does feel like you've constrained yourself pretty severely to believing that tracking overlap is a merger specific feature, that there is in fact no way technologically to know whether somebody is getting an ad unless the two platforms belong to the same corporation. And I feel like computer scientists could tell you lots of different ways to do that. Like there could be a pixel that lands on my handset and recognizes the ad and stops me from seeing it again. So letting the platform frame the debate to be, this is the reason we need to be in the same corporation because we're going to deliver this social benefit, seems unnecessarily generous. And I wanted your reaction to that.
Could I just take the moderator privilege and just add, right? But your papers are in conversation on exactly that point, because the removal of ATT seems to have not reduced the ability for apps to collect data across different kinds of people. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, maybe I did not express myself very clearly before. I mean, I'm not saying that, yeah, I mean, there is a change, there is a very significant change. There is a reduction of third-party tracking. I was pointing it more in as a limitation more than a fact, in the sense that I cannot really measure the first-party tracking. So I cannot absolutely say this third-party tracking was not replaced by first-party tracking because of limitation of the architecture. So in the case of SDKs, I can observe the SDK. In the case of first-party tracking, it's embedded in the operating system, so I don't observe it. So I'm just trying to be open to the possibility that this may be going on. I don't believe that is the case. Right? So sorry if I did not wasn't clear on that.
Just quickly though, there's a difference between first-party tracking and third-party tracking in terms of how you relate to your end customer.
Right. I mean, and people may be fine with Apple tracking that. Maybe they, I mean, I'm right or not. Maybe they trust Apple more than they trust, like, I don't know who these third-party companies are. I mean, it's one company versus the Wild West of SDKs that track people for whatever purpose. So yeah, I mean, even if there is this shift from third-party to first-party tracking, people may like it, may have other antitrust considerations, but from that perspective, it may be rational to like that or to be fine with that substitution of tracking.
Yeah, so I would say that I think this is a useful framing because I think there are kind of like two reasons that are in the model for why you might be skeptical of a platform separation. One is the usual results that platform competition might not improve welfare. We find that that's not the case in this context. Based on our estimates, just pure increased platform competition is not enough to not cause positive welfare effects. I think pointing out the fact that the sign flips mostly due to this duplication thing, maybe recognizing that that's not a merger specific efficiency is a nice point to make, which is if it were possible and if we could find a way to do this, then we should, and maybe still separate the two platforms, and that's overall positive for welfare. Right. So I think making a clear delineation on that point is probably valuable.
Yes, yeah, both are excellent studies. I have a question for Justine. I wonder whether you can tie your results with the merger review policy, like from the government's perspective, if they're reviewing the next merger of Facebook, Instagram merger. Like in your study, you can look at user diversion ratio. It's not that big, and right, and then but there are strong two-sidedness between the your study can say anything about like what the merger reviewer should do in such a case. Ratio as well as with the merger efficiencies. I mean, the duplication, get rid of duplication could be one, and better targeting advertising with more data, and that may be two. So I don't know whether you can put those pieces more in a more kind of straightforward way for merger reviewers. For Christotle, I think there's a rush of entry of apps right after COVID, and that's maybe like a year before the ATT. So I don't know whether that have any implication for the exits afterwards. That's the rush of entry may sort of plan C's for rush of exits. I don't know whether you can distinguish that. And also, I don't know to what extent you can say anything about developers multi-homing. Like, are they going to have the app in both Android and Apple system, or they now choose more in Android only?
Yeah, okay, so the rush of entry because of COVID, I have not thought of that one before. Just thinking on the top of my mind, I mean, that was one of the reasons why we try to look at like a long period, but not too long period, because these things can change. So the other thing to consider is that the app ecosystem is super dynamic. So apps are created and destroyed all the time. The half-life of an app is like about 6 months. So yeah, 2021 to COVID, maybe it's already factoring, maybe those people like rushing to the market, realize this was not their thing. The cycle may already be over, even though it's like just a year and a half, because of this very short life cycle. Sorry, was there another question? Oh, the multi-homing. Yeah, we're looking into it. I mean, that is one of the things we're interested on. It was not so easy to link the same app, so we have been doing a lot of work to know who are the multi-homers and the single homers. But yeah, that's a very interesting point. Like, will they abandon the Apple one and just stay on the? My guess would be probably not. I mean, if we don't see exit of single commerce, why would we see? We should see in the aggregate numbers if people are opting for that strategy. But yeah, we're checking it.
And then to answer your question about what this means for merger review, I mean, I think the main benefit of our work for that is in just sort of recognizing the different pieces of the puzzle. So on the user side, you care about both diversion and advertiser elasticity. I think for the reasons I caveated, you might be a little concerned that the diversion ratios we estimate are too short term to be the final word on that. But there is some indication that for the purposes of merger review, maybe there should be relatively more focus on the advertiser side. Having said that, studying the advertiser side still requires understanding user multi-homing and overlap. I think the question about whether separation, like how separation would affect like targeting systems, things along those lines, like we don't have much to say about that. I think it's an important area to see whether, I guess how important it is, like if it's important to have joint ownership to have improved targeting. I think we don't have much to say on that point. The final thing to note, I think, is maybe speaking to Fiona's point a little bit more, just recognizing which pieces of increased competition on the advertiser side are, unambiguously good, maybe ambiguously good, depending on the technological environment in a separate equilibrium. And so I think, being able to enumerate all those pieces is important.
Thanks. Really, really fascinating work. I have 3 questions, one for Cristobal and then 2 for Justin. I think, Cristobal, your findings, if they were found on the web, they would be tremendous. Like the idea that you cut off some avenue for third-party tracking, and then essentially find that all the same content producers stay in the market and nothing really changes. This would like really fly in the face of, I think, a lot of the ongoing narrative about the value of tracking to support the open web. So I'm just curious if you have any reflections on that, based on the findings from the Apple app ecosystem. And then Justin, I'm glad that Fiona asked her question, because I was actually wondering if you have assumed in your mental model of what would happen under a separation, that the 2 companies would actually be prevented from sharing user data with third parties, such that those third parties would be able to correlate across, which is like a very common practice today, right? The sort of audience matching. So I'm just wondering if you're either assuming or proposing that like be part of the remedy, that the companies be prohibited from doing that for some reason, or on the alternative, if they're not prohibited from doing it, then I feel like my mind went the same place as Fiona's, which is it seems like they could perhaps somewhat trivially be able to, advertisers would have third parties available to them who could prevent the duplication. So I was just wondering how you think about that in the context of the remedy. And then last question is, I'm curious if there's anything you have to offer or for us to think about vis-a-vis TikTok. Like if we think about TikTok as perhaps the largest competitor on the advertiser side, at least for Instagram, if not for Facebook as well, and we think about them exiting, what would you expect?
So on the first question of like this result on the open web, like thank you for the question. I do have a paper that says that, but with GDPR. So with GDPR, we did that study. We look at websites and like ad-supported websites. We track them for a very long time and find pretty much the same. Like there's no exit. It was recently accepted like last November, December in management science. We spent like 2 years proving that there was really no effect on scraping more and more and more data to convince reviewers that it really did not affect the open web. I am working now on ATT on looking at how like publishers, so we have data on ad impressions on publishers, so we know who they're selling the advertising to, and we're trying to estimate if this Apple ATT generated any effect on how the advertising impressions were redistributed and how much money they were making out of Apple users versus other users. In the case of the ATT, I think it would be a lot harder to observe an effect on the open web because not everyone uses Apple devices. So that's why we're looking at like, okay, is your revenue coming from Apple devices users changing because of ATT? And we just started that, but I think it's an interesting question. My expectation is that I would expect less of an effect than in GDPR because, yeah, they have other revenue avenues.
So maybe taking your questions in reverse order. How to think about TikTok. I kind of wish that the time of the experiments overlapped with, the entry and possibly exit of TikTok, so I could say a little more about it. I think, certainly introduces competitive pressures. It's to some extent in our model to the extent that TikTok's like a non-strategic outside option, which it probably isn't. But I think adding a third competitor in the marketplace certainly does change the equilibrium. The question of whether kind of avoiding overlap is completely trivial. My impression is that user attribution systems haven't just solved this problem on the web entirely. Like, to the extent that it's trivial to do this, then advertisers wouldn't have to worry about duplicated impressions when looking between meta platforms and, for example, Google's audience network or things of that nature. And so I think there are ways to, maybe attenuate some of the costs, but at least my understanding is that it's not possible to completely eliminate it, maybe to the extent that a jointly owned company would. The other thing to say is that maybe there's less of an incentive to develop, extremely high quality attribution systems because Facebook and Instagram are jointly owned. And so, to Fiona's point, after separation, if there were these huge gains to this, then there'd be more investment from third parties to try to develop those tools. I think it's, we build into our model as a feature of a merge versus separated equilibrium. I think breaking out its individual effects is helpful to see, what would happen based on alternative assumptions about how merger specific that is.
Great. Well, that brings us right up to lunch. So thank you very much. Let's thank our panelists.